Hello. In this video we're going to be talking about how to write a philosophy paper. So the plan for this video, I'm going to talk about my late paper policy just so that we all have it in the front of our minds. And then we're going to work through how to write a philosophy paper. Then at the end I'm going to give some tips about writing philosophy papers and give you the chance to think about any questions that you may have that you can reach out to me with. Okay. So, as I'm sure you all remember from the introductory video for this class, my late paper policy works like this. So, you lose 5% per day that the paper's late up to 25%. So, after 5 days, you stop losing points when you get to 25. And the reason that I set up my late paper policy this way is so that there's always a reason to turn in your paper even if it's really, really late. I like to make room in my class for our students. You know, sometimes you get kind of knocked off course, but I always want you to be able to rally and get things back together. But it's also set up so that I can give you an honest grade on the paper that you submit, and there can still be some points left. So I originally tried this with up to 50%, but then I discovered that it's like, well, you know, if you turn in a paper where you lose 50% of the points and you get like a 75 on that, there's basically no points left. So in any case, that's why I have this policy set up that way. All right. So a few things that are unique about a philosophy paper. So a philosophy paper is neither a research paper nor is it an exercise in literary self-expression, okay? Instead, it's a reasoned defense of a thesis. Now, when we're presenting a reasoned defense of a thesis, clarity is valued over style, and something that can be a little bit uncomfortable for students while they're learning how to do it, it's best to use the first person I while writing the paper, right? Because in this case, you're the one defending this thesis, and so you get to write the paper in the first person, which can be a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that once you get it down, it can be a pretty good way to write. So the paper for this class is going to follow a very precise format. So when I say that your paper is a reasoned defense of a thesis, don't worry. You're not going to have to come up, part of the thesis you'll come up with, but you're not going to have to come up with a thesis all on your own that you're going to have to reasonably defend. The paper for this class is going to follow a very precise format. And the point is to closely investigate the argument that you're looking at in your paper. And of course, this is going to be one of the arguments that we looked at in the first 3 weeks of class, the arguments for the proofs for the existence of God. All right. Now, the papers that I'm going to have you write include a variety of parts. So there's the introduction, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all of these parts, but the introduction, the presentation of the argument, the objection to the argument, including making your case for the objection and explaining what effect your objection will have on the argument, a response to this objection, a reply to a response to this objection, and a conclusion. So there's a variety of different ways to think about this, but I think that a nice way to think about this is that your paper will require 6 paragraphs, and these are the 6 paragraphs that it will require. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to have 6 paragraphs, but it should mean that there shouldn't be less than 6. There should be at least 6. If to accomplish some of these tasks, you need a couple more paragraphs, no problem. But in any case, minimum, it should be 6. Okay, so now I'm going to go through each of these sections in turn. And to do this, I'm going to return to my argument, my ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac that we might remember from week 2. Okay, so just to quickly remind you of the argument, this is a ridiculous argument that's supposed to show a potential problem with the ontological argument. But premise 1, by the perfect Big Mac, we mean a Big Mac than which none greater can be conceived. Premise 2, if we understand what it means to speak of something, then that thing exists in our understanding. Premise 3, so the perfect Big Mac exists in our understanding. Premise 4, but if the perfect Big Mac really is a Big Mac than which none greater can be conceived, then the perfect Big Mac must not just exist in our understanding, but also exist in reality. Because if the perfect Big Mac didn't also exist in reality, there would be something greater, namely the Big Mac that existed both in our understanding and in reality. So the perfect Big Mac exists both in our understanding and in reality. I'm sure we all remember this argument. Okay, so this is going to be the argument that I use while I present how to write a philosophy paper. Okay, so introductions for philosophy papers are very boring. To begin, you write your thesis that you're going to defend. Then you explain in detail exactly how you're going to defend it. And something that's strange is that I recommend that you write your introduction and your conclusion after you've finished the rest of the paper. As we'll see, the introduction and the conclusion are very formulaic, and I think that it's actually just often easier to sort of write the guts of your paper and then come back and write the introduction and the conclusion last. Now, I'm very serious about including the introduction and the conclusion, and I'm also very serious about including the introduction and the conclusion in exactly the way that I'm expressing here. Not exactly, you don't have to use the exact words that I'm using, right? But I want it to be in the neighborhood of what I'm saying here. And this is going to mean that it's different than basically any introduction that you've ever written for another paper in school, okay? So I get that, and I want you to write my kind of introduction. And if you don't, you'll lose points. And quite frankly, most of the time that people don't do as well on this paper as they might like, it's because they don't do the introduction and the conclusion right. That's a silly way to lose points, a silly reason. So just follow these instructions. Okay, so here's what I mean when I say that I want you to write the thesis that you're going to defend and then explain in detail exactly how you're going to defend it. So, the thesis. In this paper, I'm going to provide my analysis of Nick's ontological Big Mac argument and ultimately argue that the argument fails. Okay? So, we'll see here clarity over style. The argument and ultimately argue that the argument fails, right? Not the sentence with the most style, but very clear. And then when I say that I want you to explain exactly how you're going to do it, this is what I have in mind. In order to do this, first, I'm going to present Nick's ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac. Then I'm going to object to the fourth premise that the claim that because this perfect Big Mac is understood as a Big Mac than which none greater can be thought, it must exist in both in our understanding and reality. Next, I'm going to provide a response to this objection, and then explain in detail why this response doesn't work and the argument fails. So you see what I'm saying when I want you to go through exactly what you're going to do in the paper. I want you to go through paragraph by paragraph and explain exactly what's happening in each paragraph. Okay? And then, all right. So, the next part of the paper, presenting the argument. So, presenting the argument is important, and if we think back to both Aquinas and Russell, we'll remember that when they were going to criticize an argument, they first presented the argument clearly that they were going to criticize. I want you to do that in your paper as well. So I want you to present the argument in your own words as clearly as possible. I don't want you to put block quotes from the text, from the readings, but it is fine to use basically the same words that I use in my argument sketches or that you find in the text. Okay, so this is sort of, it's in between block quotes, right, and quotes, okay? So I want you to be able to, you obviously need to use the ideas from the text, right? And it's okay to use the same words for those ideas. So, for example, if you're presenting Anselm's argument, and God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, it's totally okay to say that Anselm begins his argument by claiming that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. You don't have to put that string of words into your own words. It's okay to carry that over, right? But I don't want you to just either block quote my videos or my framings of the argument or giant chunks of text. All right. But I want you to put the arguments into sentences that work together and that are understandable. So I've often presented the argument in premise conclusion form. I want you to put it into prose. And I also want you to explain why each premise is plausible, or what work each premise is doing in the argument. Okay, so to give you a little bit more idea about how this might work, so we'll remember our argument. I'm not going to go through it again, right? But you might begin something like this. Nick's ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac begins by defining the perfect Big Mac as a Big Mac than which none greater can be conceived. Than which none greater can be conceived means that this Big Mac is so great that it's greater than any other Big Mac that I can imagine or interact with. This premise is plausible because it's effectively just defining the perfect Big Mac. The second premise of this argument claims that if we understand what it means to speak of something, then that thing exists in our understanding. This means that, okay, so and if we'll remember back, the first few assignments while we were considering these arguments involved having you go through and expand on each of the premises in the arguments, right? And part of why I'm doing this is to get you ready for this part of the paper. Okay. Next part, coming up with an objection. Now, when you're brainstorming, I encourage you to come up with as many objections as you possibly can. Come up with 25 or 30 if you can come up with that many, right? However, in your paper, you should only use one objection, the best objection that you have, or the one that you can write the most about, whichever one it is, okay? So, what I don't want you to do is to come up with 2 or 3 objections to the argument and then put all of those in your paper. That is not a winning strategy for this paper. I want you to pick one and focus on it. So you can feel free to use any of the objections that have come up in class, or you can come up with your own original objection. So we'll remember that Aquinas objected to Anselm in a bunch of different ways. You can use any one of those objections that you want, only one, but any one, or you can come up with your own objection. We'll also remember that Russell had quite a few objections to Aquinas. You can use any of those objections you want. You can similarly use any of the objections that I gave to Paley, or any objections that you can come up with to Pascal. It's up to you. But I also want you to make the case for your objection. So for example, you can't just say, I object to premise 4 because without it the argument doesn't work. So I want you to present your objection and then expand on why your objection works, what it does. Then I also want you to talk about the effect of the objection. So I want you to explain what impact your objection is going to have on the argument. Why does your objection matter? Does the way that you're challenging the premises change anything about the argument? Thinking about this hopefully will allow you to avoid presenting an objection that doesn't do anything, something that happens from time to time, or presenting an objection that actually really isn't an objection at all. Okay, so our argument again. We might object to this 4th premise here, right? So we'll remember that that's actually exactly what this argument was designed to show. But when we're considering this ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac, right, we might think that it doesn't make any sense that just because I can think of the perfect Big Mac in my mind, that it might also exist in reality. And when we're objecting, we would lay out why we think that. Okay. The next step in the paper is the response to the objection. At the heart of a philosophy class is realizing that there are objections to every single view that you can hold, and also responses to these objections. That, I think, is the fun of philosophy. No matter what position you hold, there's always an objection to it. But I think it's also one of the great things that we can learn from this class. All right. One of the ways to realize this is by working through the exercise of responding to your own objection. Okay, so if we remember where we are in the paper, you had the introduction, then you presented the argument, Then you objected to the argument, and what I want you to do next is come up with a response to the objection. Okay? So it's important that you present a serious response to your objection and actually try to get into the mind of a person who doesn't like the objection that you presented. Okay? And if we're considering a response to the Big Mac argument, we remember that we objected to premise 4, right? And someone who is trying to defend that sweet argument that I created might say something along the lines of like, well, look, just because it doesn't seem like thinking of the perfect Big Mac can make the perfect Big Mac exist in reality, that clearly has to follow from the argument, right? And so on, okay? All right. So the next section, a reply to this response. So in your reply to the response, you can do one of two things. You can either argue that the response to the objection fails, right? And so the objection is good and the original argument fails. Or you can argue that the response to the objection works and so the objection fails, and as a result, the original argument is defended. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically the idea is, if we walk through the steps, right, we have our introduction, then we present the argument, then we have an objection to the argument, and then we have a response to the objection, right? And either that response is good, and then the objection is good and the argument fails, or the response is not good and the argument goes through. Okay? So I don't want you to simply say that there's no possible response to this objection. There is always a response to every objection. Okay? So, the conclusion. Conclusions are just as boring as introductions. Begin by identifying the thesis that you defended and explain exactly what you just did in the paper to defend it. Then, conclude with 3 or 4 sentences expanding on what you learned from working through this argument carefully. Now, I have the star there because this last piece is not necessarily a part of a normal philosophy paper, but it's something that I include because I think that it's valuable for us to reflect on what we learn from going through these exercises. I'm not just doing it because I think you have to or that you should. I think that there's actually value in working through these things, and I want you to reflect on what that value might be. So here's an example of what I have in mind by this conclusion. You'll see it's very similar to the introduction. In this paper, I argue that Nick's ontological Big Mac argument ultimately fails. To do this, I first presented Nick's ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac. Then I objected to the 4th premise. Next, I presented a response to this objection. And finally, a reply to this response, arguing that the original objection is good, and so the argument fails. And then the next part. When I first read Nick's argument, I thought that there was something funny about its conclusion that the perfect Big Mac must exist. I realized that the part of the problem was that just because I can imagine a Big Mac, than which none greater can be thought, this should not mean that this Big Mac exists both in my understanding and in reality. Interestingly, this process also taught me about Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, an argument that I always struggled to understand before. Okay, a few tips. So, there should be no reason to cite anything other than possibly the page numbers from your reading. So you can do this simply by putting them in parentheses after the quotation, right? So something like this, quotation from the book, page 145. All right. So again, you shouldn't need to cite anything other than the book, right? You'll have the book, you'll have my videos, you'll have any notes that you've written from the videos, and just your thinking. Unlike a lot of assignments, the whole point of this is just to get you to think about the argument and how you might object to it. I don't really care about what anybody in the world has said. I just want you to think through it, and I want you to come up with your objection. And following from this, I encourage you not to try to find answers on the internet. Instead, you should spend some time brainstorming before you begin so that you know exactly what part of the argument you're going to object to and how you're going to object, what your response to the objection is going to be, and how you're going to reply to this response. As I've said, I think it's helpful to write the introduction and conclusion last. Also, feel free to be obnoxious or combative or contrarian or not, right? What matters is that you present the argument clearly, that you clearly present each part of the paper correctly, and that you work through the process of this paper. I don't care about what your tone is, and if any of these tones is more pleasant for you to write in, by all means do that. Another tip, extra stuff, to fill space is not good. Sometimes I know that in college papers, we just like, oh man, I wrote 3 paragraphs of BS because I had to get 5 pages. Like, I don't care how long this paper is, right? And if you spend a bunch of space just talking about garbage, that is irritating to me, and there is no reason to do it, right? This paper has no length requirement. I want you to work through the steps, however long that takes. I don't care how long it takes, if it takes 2 pages or if it takes 5. It normally takes students about 3 pages, so that's where you should probably end up. But there is no reason to use extra stuff to fill space, so don't do it. This being said, you can feel free to include an appendix at the end where you can write anything extra that you like that won't fit into the paper but that you want to say. Now, this is not a requirement. Again, this is not a requirement, but sometimes students, they work through this process and it just brings all of these like thoughts and ideas to their mind and they want to express them to me, but they're not sure where they fit in the paper. So if they don't clearly fit in the paper, by all means, just put appendix at the end and then write everything else that you're thinking that you want me to read or that you want me to know. I'm happy to look at it and think about it. It won't affect the grade on your paper. Again, you're not required to do this, but if this experience brings up a bunch of extra ideas that you have and you want to share them with me, by all means, just put an appendix at the end of the paper and include these ideas. So notice that you don't have to personally agree with any of the things that you're arguing in this paper, right? The point is to work through the process of objecting to an argument, responding to this objection, and then replying to your response. Your personal views can be separate from all of this. They can be anything. And again, it doesn't matter to me what your personal views are or what you argue in the paper or the connection between those things. I would just encourage you to see this as an excellent opportunity to explore these ideas. Okay, so I'm sure that there's quite a few questions, and I will make space for questions after this video. So in any case, if you have questions, please reach out to me.